Hello, in this video, I want to talk a little bit more about the worker strike resolution that's coming up in LD and the question of abolition. I think that it's really important to talk about in terms of how you're thinking about what defines itself as a worker strike and its effect on various types of structures of violence, because it would be basically really unprecedented if the U.S. specifically, or if any government really recognized the worker strike as a right to the citizen. And I think that it's a really interesting place to kind of think about the interesting debate that happens between what state recognition does in various places in its most radical form, I guess, and what we could really imagine recently, and comparing that to what it looks like to do kind of radical alternatives outside of that, or the ability to think about why the infinite refusal of state recognition as any time as being able to ever be productive or conducive, and why that kind of refusal needs to stay consistent is I think a really interesting debate that is really central to this resolution. In the last two videos, we did a little bit of talking about how this type of criticism would be read against policy teams, and so I do with a lot of the other videos that I usually do, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think policy teams can better respond to this argument, because I definitely think it's something that will show up and be really important to the conversation of what is really defined as a worker strike. And so I think it's really important for teams to really have a strong kind of line of defense towards it. I think that in general, when I'm trying to figure out just kind of what are the priorities for how I should be answering and responding to an argument like this from a policy perspective, I feel the first thing that you really want to get to is what are the easiest ways for you to create the two easiest, most common type of affirmative ballots, i.e. one where you're able to win an impact outweighs ballot, and kind of just reason why the app's kind of consideration of what is important from the worker strike is just more important than whether or not we're able to create movements of resistance everywhere, or be an argument that's just there is a world in which the 1AC or the plan is able to kickstart abolition movements, work along with them, etc., or the 1AC is able to explain the worker strike in a definition in such a way that includes prisoners in a way that is able to actually produce a differential relationship to what would be recognized under the worker strike kind of resolution as a whole. And I think that as kind of just the two avenues for where you want to get to is a really good place to start. And then I think that from there, a lot of the other places that you should really be working towards is trying to figure out a way for you to create really nuanced responses to the alternative that explain why a world in which the plan isn't able to pass only makes it harder for the alternative to kind of realize its impacts. And regardless of whether or not the 1AC is able to resolve every form of structural violence or create protests everywhere, it is able to stop some of the worst form of material impacts from happening proximately. And I think that can be a really interesting debate to start breaking down in terms of why that could outweigh just the question of proximity, because of the way in which it magnifies a lot of the impacts that people could go for when we're near criticism like this. And so overall, I definitely think that there is a diversity of strategies to go for, and I really want to talk about how a lot of these can be set up differently. And so yeah, that's kind of where we're going to start. I think that when we're just generally trying to figure out how we should be dealing with the framing portion of this debate, a lot of the question for what you should be doing to frame this debate correctly is kind of moving beyond just the question of I think for a lot of affirmatives about whether or not we're able to just win that the question of the impacts of the 1AC should be weighed, but really a question of the way in which the 1AC is kind of weighed versus the alternative. I've said this with a lot of the criticisms that have been read throughout this, when I've been just thinking about this resolution, making videos for it, because I think that a lot of times in a lot of the debates that I've seen in Judge, a lot of teams are really kind of satisfied with just being able to get their impacts weighed, but I don't think that allows you to do the full weight of putting a lot of pressure on the alternative. And I think in a resolution like this, it's really important to make sure that the alternative can hold up in a way that's competitive with the affirmative, because I definitely think when you're talking about a set of arguments that's just so specific and proximate to the stuff that we're going through now, it's a lot harder for people to really win that they're able to it's a lot harder for people to be able to win that they should be able to just bypass all the material concerns that are brought up when we're talking about the ways in which violence is happening because of the lack of the ability for the state to recognize a worker strike. And I think that being able to really push that discussion as why your framing needs to be accountable for the ability for the alternative to compete at a tactics kind of strategic level, a material level with the affirmative, is just as important as being able to weigh the consequences between the impacts of both advocacies. I then think that when you're able to kind of tie why this is important to not just questions of education education, but why it's important to just like hold people to their counter advocacies as a way to think about like how this topic should go procedurally. It's really important to think about like why that could be like an essential part of how we're able to like frame and think about the discussions that are necessary to make the resolution productive. I feel like there are a lot of arguments to be made about why like there wouldn't be in-depth debates about like what types of things can be done in relationship to like other forms of like movement making, etc., and why every debate would just belittle down to like state recognition, good or bad, and why that's like a really stale and kind of like not balanced way to really think about like how the resolution should kind of progress and like become like a full resolution of like education dialogue. And I think that being able to lean on a lot of that stuff as well in terms of like why your framing is so advantageous is really important for you to be able to make like a full frame or argument that really stands out against arguments like this and kind of adds that extra nuance to make sure that you're holding the team to a higher standard than just being able to make like link arguments that actually outweigh the affirmative. I think that outside of that, the other place where it's really important to go is being able to win that at a thesis level, you're really able to compete and really take serious the concerns that are really being brought by the abolition criticism. I think that regardless of whether or not you want to say the impacts to the AF outweighs or you want to be able to go for a more like permutation based strategy, it's really important to explain like the ways in which the AF and the negative are really tied to each other. I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways in which I think there are a lot of really interesting ways in which just asking the question of like who is defined as worker and your ability to just offensively answer that and be able to be like, there's a way in which we're like changing the human rights framework with this. There's a way in which we're creating a model for even if we're not able to win that prisoners are able to be recognized as workers like per the passing of the 1.8c, that there is ability to kickstart the various forms of legibles demands that kind of like make these things corrective and solve proximate causes a lot faster than a lot of the stuff that can be offered from the alternative. And I think being able to just start and really like be able to win warranted analysis of that and not just be able to be like this is something that just happens could be a really powerful argument to have pieces in the debate. I think that having arguments just in general about how like the flow of movements kind of like are able to kickstart each other and how movements are able to build momentum even when they're across like different vectors of talking about violence and how like it kind of energizes people and things like that can be really good places to kind of start with why these things might be true, and then moving into other places about like how other types of like definitions of workers have been expanded to include prisoners in various ways, and the way in which that kind of like pamphlet can be used and replicated to the way in which the 1AC is operating could be a really interesting way for you to kind of like phrase the top level portion of this debate and have a really just I think well thought out debate as a whole. Hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing talking about just abolition in general and abolition on the worker strike resolution. And yeah, as always, thanks for tuning in.